Over to you, 25 minutes. I'll start the clock as soon as you start speaking.
Okay, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. I seek protection in God from Satan the accursed. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. Qala rabbi shrah li sadri wa yassir li amri wahlul 'uqdatan min lisani yafqahu qawli. Sadaqallah, sadaqallahul azim. Well, thank you again, Samuel. And this is a topic that I essentially proposed, and I wanted to break some of the stereotypes. And so you've given me a wonderful opportunity, Samuel, to basically address some of these misconceptions and stereotypes which have been used by Christian polemicists and, of course, missionaries over the particular years. Now, what are we dealing with? We're dealing with these so-called pre-Islamic goddesses, Allat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, that are mentioned in Islamic history. Allat was a so-called daughter of Allah, along with the two other goddesses, Al-Uzza and Manat. And essentially, you've pointed this out. The summary of the satanic, in Surah 53, you read the expression, أَفَرَأَيْتُمُ اللَّاتَ وَالْعُزَّى وَمَنَاةَ الثَّالِثَةَ الْأُخْرَى ومناة الثالثة الأخرى ألكم الذكر ولو أنثى تلك إذن قسمة ضيزى. That, have you considered Lat and Uzza and Manat the third? What for you the male and for him the female? Most certainly this is an unfair division. So in other words, a sarcastic, cynical condemnation in relation to these particular goddesses. But the summary of the satanic verses, which Samuel has essentially told us quite articulately at the introduction, is that you had a situation where well, at the outset, let's just start off with this. The satanic verses, it's an Orientalist defamatory term. There's no term called the satanic verses. Samuel should have mentioned this to us. The whole saga in the hadith literature is known as the hadith of the Gharanik al-Ula. Gharanik meaning crane. Islamic sources are not responsible for this. This was coined by a missionary by the name of William Mere, an Orientalist English missionary who fashioned the term satanic verses. The question that missionaries and Islamophobes basically run away and not answer is, number one, looking at the source of the story. Samuel attempted to present some degree of source. Is it mentioned in the Quran? Clearly we've seen it hasn't. Are there any hadiths which mention any of this information? And why do all the reports contradict each other, which is what Samuel attempted to allude to, but he said it doesn't make any significant problem. Now, the hermeneutical issues obviously is, did the Prophet utter it? Why did the Prophet utter it? Did the Prophet realize on his own that he erred or was corrected by Jibreel? And why does not a single riwayah mention the story? Now, Samuel mentioned 37 and he alluded to the book by Shahab Ahmad. But, you know, with all respect, and I don't say it to you, but you have to keep up with the latest research. This is Shahab Ahmad's book from 2015, and he's late now, but he narrates something like 50. And his particular perspective has somewhat changed, but we're going to unpack that as we go along. Essentially, the background is that the first batch of Muslim immigrants migrated to Abyssinia. They apparently temporarily returned to Mecca based on the rumor of a compromise between the Quraysh and the Prophet. And what you find is that At-Tabari, Al-Waqidi, and some others reproduce a report in which there's a dozen different versions, and there are many chains of narrations which in effect state that as a result of the compromise, they essentially returned, and basically the increasing enmity then continued after the compromise was not fulfilled. Now, according to the story, the Prophet had been engaging in the recitation of Surah 53. Have you considered Lat, Uzza, and Manat, the third one? And then Satan caused him to recite the words, تِلْكَ الْغَرَانِكَ الْعُلَى وَإِنَّ شَفَاعَتَهُنَّ لَا تُرْجَى. That these are the beautiful high-ranking birds. Surely the intercession is anticipated. Gharanik, something which the pagans never referred to, Gharanik. And then after that, according to the story, which Samuel has to address, is that there were two verses, Surah 17 verse 73 and Surah 22 verse 52, which were revealed to rebuke the Prophet and to in fact reassure the Prophet. And as a result of that, the Quraysh then subsequently became angry and renewed the enmity, and the opposition increased with vehemence. And then news of the prostration of the incident reached Abyssinia in the form of a rumor, and when they came back, they realized that this was not entirely true. Now, these were the two verses which were said to have cancelled the satanic verses. Surah 17 and Surah 22 verse 52. Now, I want people to follow through because we're going to get technical in some of these issues that we are going to basically raise. Let's go to the source. The source for this, one of the sources at least, is Ibn Jarir Tabari. Now, if you look at Tabari, at the outset, this is the disclaimer he's got. Now, I'm going to translate it in English. He basically says, let him who examines this book of mine know that I have in fact information I've mentioned therein which I stipulated to be accurate. But if I mention in this book a report some men of the past may find essentially objectionable, and which the reader basically finds objectionable or worthy of censure because he sees no aspect of truth, no any factual substance to it, let him who know that this is not to be attributed to us, but to those who transmitted it. So Tabari was a chronicler. He was not a producer of the narrative, he was a chronicler. You've got the same thing in Kitab al-Tabakat al-Kabir by Ibn Sa'd, and neither al-Tabari or Ibn Sa'd, Samuel, are in fact responsible for producing these particular stories. I think it's important they're chroniclers. If you look at Tarif Khalidi's book, Arabic Historical Thought in Classical Work, he basically states that it is clear that Waqidi is in fact the senior partner. Ibn Sa'd is known as the secretary of Waqidi, and Waqidi was the collator of this Maghazi literature, was attacked for the loose isnad, chain of narration usage by the strict practitioners of hadith. All the major classical scholars, all of the major classical scholars, and I'm going to deal with Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hajar, reject it. Imam Razi, for example, in his commentary states that the hadith scholars have found the story to be weak. Ibn Khuzaymah was asked regarding the story, declared it to be from heretics in Fakhruddin Razi. Ibn Hazm declared the satanic verses story as a forgery and not reliable. Ibn Hajar admits himself that not all accepts mursal narrations. And I'm going to ask Samuel to unpack what he means and understands by mursal narrations. Imam Muslim, who is cited in his introduction to Sahih Muslim, said that mursal narrations cannot be held authoritative, and Ibn Salah says the same thing. So the question missionaries need to ask is that in accepting this particular narrative, the question I need to ask Samuel is what objective scientific and historical methodology are they utilizing for insisting that the version of the story that appeals to is correct? In the context of what literary genres or cultural products or projects were the narratives transmitted, and what were the mechanisms and practices by which they were transmitted. Now, Samuel hasn't addressed this. He's basically gone with the so-called conventional view, but hasn't addressed this specifically, and I'm going to ask him to deal with this in the rebuttal session. The second set of questions is, are there any eyewitness testimony reports? You see, we hold a higher standard. In the previous debate, I said there's no eyewitness testimony for the New Testament. What are the eyewitness testimony reports to the satanic verses? Are there any? Are there any authentic reports, Sahih reports? And this is a question that Samuel has to deal with. If you look at the Sihah Sitta, all the 6 major collections of hadith, none of them, not one, actually mentions the satanic verses. None of them mention the satanic verses. If you, for example, look at the Quranic evidence against the satanic verses, Surah 60 verse 4, if he the messenger were to invent any saying in our name, surely we would have seized him by the right hand, we would have cut off the artery. Surah 10 verse 15, it's not of my own accord to change it. Surah 41 verse 42, no falsehood can approach it from the front nor from behind, it is sent down from Allah. Surah 25 verse 32, we make your heart thereby, we dictate it in stages. So there's Quranic evidence against satanic verses. The Sihah Sitta, the major collections, none of them contain it. Even Bukhari has this particular narrative, which Samuel alluded to, which doesn't contain the satanic verses. But essentially, what happens is that in a broad sense, Bukhari does not contain it. Bukhari has this particular event in Surah Al-Najm, Surah 53. But essentially, what basically happens is that it doesn't narrate the satanic verses. We're going to deal with that in the rebuttal session if I have the time. The satanic verses violates the Quran at a fundamental level. The alleged interpretation violated the principle of Tawheed. He shall under no circumstances forgive Allah. Professor Muhammad Muhar Ali in Sirat al-Nabi and the Orientalists. And the story is found totally unworthy of any kind of credence. The story violates the Quranic precepts at a number of levels. For example, the Quran says it was the unbelievers who made the attempt at inducing the Prophet. The story says that the Prophet made the compromise. The Quran says that the Prophet is immune from compromise. The story says that the Prophet was not immune from compromise and even made a fundamental error. When did the incident take place? I think this is most important. Samuel glossed over this in his narration about the chronological sequence. It established that this happened in the month of Rajab. That's during the month of Shawwal. And if the story is to be connected with this, the incident narrated must have taken place before the month of Shawwal, or maybe in Ramadan of that particular year. But Surah Bani Israel and Surah Al-Hajj, you know those 2 surahs in the beginning which are said to rebuke the Prophet, which are said to censure the Prophet, actually took place several years later. According to all accounts, Surah Hajj was revealed in the first year of the Hijrah. Surah Bani Israel was revealed during the time of the Mi'raj. So here's a problem that I've got, is that does the satanic verses stand up to chronological integrity? Because those riwayas which narrate the satanic verses narrate these two verses as rebuking the prophet after having narrated them. And the two verses which were said to rebuke the prophet were revealed historically several years later after the alleged satanic verses. These two verses on my right, 1725 and 1772 and 22 verse 52. Now here's my question. It's a straining incredulity to believe, if we had to go ahead with the satanic verses narrative, that the prophet would reveal the satanic verses. This would have an indelible impression in the mind of the Sahaba. And then several years later, you'd have the verses which were said to rebuke him in accordance with the riwayas that happened much, much later. How does it stand up to chronological integrity? Help me here. I mean, the alleged disapproval of the prophet's allegation was made 5 years after its commission, whilst a notice of repeal was given basically during the first year of the Hijrah. I mean, no one can accept this kind of absurd explanation, reductio ad absurdum. Alternatively, if it is assumed that the passages in question were each revealed separately from the context of the satanic verses, but here's the problem. The riwayah mentioned 22 verse 52 and 17 as rebuking the prophet, but those verses historically were revealed several years later. So how can the satanic verses according to riwayah was just intermittent, but those verses which were said to rebuke him were revealed much, much later. So it doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit in chronologically. Other question which Samuel I want him to deal with, why were the satanic verses not incorporated in Surah Hajj? How come they were kept separately for such a long time? And so the point is that the storytellers have forcibly and unnaturally attempted to fit the passages in the story. And that's essentially what Christian polemicists rely upon. Now, generally speaking, Samuel and others like him within the polemical discourse that they operate, they normally appeal to authentic recitings like Ibn Kathir and Bukhari and so on and so forth. Why is it in this instance here alone they are repeating the narratives which is mursal? Mursal goes to a tabi'i, not even an authentic report to the Sahaba, with the exception of Ibn Abbas, who was not an eyewitness, by the way. And again, it's too convenient for the satanic verses to be revealed. Why do I say that? Because at the beginning of Surah Najm, you read, وَمَا يَنْتِقُ عَنِ الْحَوَىٰ إِنْ هُوَ إِلَّا وَحْيُ يُوحَىٰ عَلَّمَهُ شَدِيدُ الْقُوَىٰ. He does not speak out of his own. It is not but a wahi, communication to him. So it's highly convenient to believe that at the start of the surah, there's an emphasis that the prophet will not err, and then midway, you'd have a situation where the satanic verses are revealed. And so missionaries are basically clutching at straws. It's unthinkable that after announcing at the beginning of the surah that he has not gone astray, and then in the middle of the surah, he's gone astray. It doesn't make sense. And the question I want to ask Samuel is, does this reconstruction make sense? Let's look at the reconstruction of the satanic verses. Reconstruction A, and this is done by Nikolai Sinai. Consider Lat, Al-Uzza and Manat, the third one. These are the high-flying cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for. Are you to have the male and to him the female? That would be a most unjust division. Is man to have everything he wishes for when the present life and the life to come belong to only God? Now, does that make sense? Does it make sense that on the one hand they are being praised and on the next hand they're being condemned? Or in the opening chapter, consider Lat, Al-Uzza and the third Manat. It's sarcastic, cynical recitation of the gods and goddesses. Does that make sense in any capacity whatsoever? Or reconstruction B. Consider Lat al-Uzza. These are the high-flying cranes whose intercession is to be hoped for. And then it goes on, what? Are you to have the male and to him the female? In other words, in reconstruction B, you've got the satanic verses, and then straight 24-25, is man to have everything he wishes for when the present life and life to come belong to only God? It doesn't make sense, Samuel. That's the point. And I'm telling to missionaries, how do you believe in a narrative where linguistically and contextually the satanic verses does not make sense when you enter them into the passage? And this is how the riwayas narrate the incident of the satanic verses in relation to what we have. Now, I've got here an oxymoron. For example, the equivocation. Donald Trump is a good, honest, and moral man and the greatest president ever. However, he raped pornographic actors and prostitutes and amassed wealth through fraud. The United States will never have such a good president like Donald Trump. Or, the ANC is an honest, trustworthy, and legitimate government. It has engaged in 10,000 acts of corruption over the last decade. We need more honest and dedicated governments like the ANC. Now, what does this tell you, folks? This tells you that contextually, the greatest argument is it does not make sense even on the assumption that the ruwaya are accurate, which Samuel is appealing to, and I've shown you they're not. Look at this. You can't say they are high-flying cranes. What, are you to have the male and to him the female? That would mean, so you can't praise them and condemn them at the same time. You can't praise them and condemn them at the same time. Nikolai Sinai, the Quranic scholar, makes a question: does any of the hypothetical reconstructions make sense? He says reconstruction A is clearly contradictory. For verses 21 and 22, if they are to be interpreted in the sense that God does not have female deities, whilst the Quranic verses admit the existence of these deities. Reconstruction B eliminates verses 21 to 22 from the text, doesn't stand up to scrutiny. From the verses that immediately follow the Quranic verses, the reconstruction are verses 24-25, and a castigation upon man. But the scathing denouncement that you find is reconcilable with a conciliatory attitude. So if it is assumed that the Prophet wanted to conciliate with the pagan Quraysh, then why would he condemn them in the outset of the verse? And why would he basically refer to them sarcastically in the verse subsequent, or that goes along with the satanic verses? The reconstruction 1 and 2 is highly unlikely. The contextual analysis of the verses 19 to 20, there's something in hadith criticism called istifham qari, derogatory question. Even in English, you'd not speak of this when you speak about someone honorable, and I gave the example of Donald Trump. From criticism to praise to criticism, it does not make sense linguistically and contextually, and Samuel has to address this. This is Nikolai Sinai. He's written a book called The Quran, The Historical Critical Introduction, and I urge Samuel to get a copy of this. And he concludes that one must therefore conclude that the Quranic verses are apocryphal, Nikolai Sinai states, and not part of the surah. John Burton, for example, says the same thing. John Burton was a student of John Wansborough, and quoting John Burton, he says it makes sense to accept Burton's explanation that the Quranic incident is a fictitious occasion of revelation, albeit one that proved to be a grave liability for late and theologically conscientious Muslims. John Burton, I urge Samuel to get the copy of his journal, peer-reviewed journal in the Journal of Semitic Studies, 1970, volume 15, number 2, page 265, that there should be no further difficulty in suggesting that those hadiths have absolutely no historical basis. And there did exist a compelling theoretical motif for the invention of these so-called infamous hadiths. If you look at the narratives, is that the examination do not stand up to any kind of scrutiny. Why does not a single companion of the Prophet narrate this incident? None of the report is contemporary or an eyewitness. Apart from the report being mursal, all the versions suffer from the isnad persons who were considered weak, unreliable, or majhul. There are several breaks or chains in the narrators, which Samuel has already agreed upon, but he sees no problem in relation to this. Not one of the satanic verses narratives agree in any material respect. You see, you mentioned reasonable doubt, beyond reasonable doubt, but for a test of beyond reasonable doubt, there cannot be contradictions on material respects. For example, if you have contradictions on the occasion of the incident, the nature of the Prophet's alleged act, the wording of the elect satanic verses, the effect, the sequel. In the occasion, in one instance it says the Prophet was praying at the Kaaba. In another instance it says he was praying at the Kaaba along with the companions. Another instance it says he was talking to the unbelievers. Another instance it said that the surah had already been revealed and later the unbelievers came to hear about it. Then you have another instance which says that no, the unbelievers approached the Prophet and asked him to make such concessions in relation to the occasion of the incident. The nature. In one incident it says that Satan threw the alleged verses in. Another incident it says the Prophet uttered them because of his wish to deliver the satanic verses. Another incident it says there were notes of interrogation. Another incident it said that the Prophet uttered them without giving reason. Another incident it says that Satan himself imitated the Prophet's voice. Another incident it says that someone from amongst the unbelievers uttered the alleged verses. Now these are contradictions in the narratives, contradictions in the incident, and contradictions in relation to the reactions. Because in one incident it says the unbelievers were pleased and prostrated. In another incident it says Al-Walid ibn Mughira and Abu Uhayya did not prostrate. In another incident it says all prostrated. In another incident it says the unbelievers heard the satanic verses but the believers did not hear them. All the versions unanimously show no objection, and Samuel speaks about 37. But in this book, he speaks about 50 in Shahab Ahmad's latest book, which is based on his thesis, more an updated 50, he analyzes 50, And he actually, in fact, shows in the Riwayah itself how a lot of the Riwayah narratives are quoted by the individuals themselves in order to show that they're not authentic. Meaning the Riwayah shows, the narrators in the Riwayah are showing why these cannot be accepted and why they are in fact contradictory in many instances. So the important question to determine is, why is not a single report of the Sahaba showing any kind of disgust with regards to polytheism? If 22 verse 52 was revealed in Medina, if the Prophet himself had uttered it, the couplet, and realized it and retracted it, or had an inkling of the Qurayshi leaders' maneuver, then why didn't he send word of a warning to the emigrants in Abyssinia? Why did he not inform them about this change? And the reason for the existing of the satanic verses, according to many scholars, some would say that it's an odd couplet which the Qurayshi pagans mention, or that the unbelievers created a noise. John Burton, for example, states that it was many traditions. They were not lying, but they were attempting to produce the whole issue of abrogation, to in fact show or supplement the idea of abrogation. And of course the fact that early exegetes were trying to also copy, for example, the biblical themes of prophethood and the conversion to Islamic models. For example, the idea in an era where Christians furnish proof, for example, of the saints' holiness, obtained tales of satanic temptation and so on, and they wanted to incorporate that within their particular tradition. So the question I need to ask is, what is your agenda? What is a missionary agenda? What is a polemical agenda? Three major Western scholars of the 20th and 21st century, John Burton, being a student of John Wansborough, Angelika Neuwirth, professor of Quranic studies from Freie University in Berlin in Germany, and Nikolai Sinai, professor of Islamic studies at the Oriental Institute at Oxford University, and a fellow of Pembroke College at Oxford University, rejects this. And a growing number of Quranic scholars, for example, I think, and subject to correction, Fred Donner. If you look at the Cambridge Companion to the Quran, you've got people like, for example, hear me out, Craig Considine, John Esposito as one example. You've got the student of John Esposito, John O'Vall. You've got Yvonne Yazbek Haddad from Georgetown University. And subject to correction, Karen Armstrong. She's not a scholar, but she's a nun, a former nun, that have cast doubt upon the credibility of this particular narrative. And why do missionaries stick on this? Why do they stick on this? And so, in conclusion, what you can find is that almost every major Islamic scholar has rejected the satanic verses, including Ibn Taymiyyah. You mentioned Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah doesn't agree with the fact that the Prophet uttered the satanic verses. He says it was an interjection by Satan himself, like Ibn Hajar Asqalani. Every major Islamic scholar has rejected the satanic verses as a fabrication. Those who accepted it excluded the Prophet's role. Many modern Western scholars have rejected the satanic verses as a fabrication based on the lack of credibility, the inadequacy in the narrative. None of the major hadith collections contain this narrative. None. Why not? None of the reporters is contemporary with the Prophet, nor an eyewitness. Isnad does not go beyond the second generation tabi'een after the Prophet. The story makes no structural sense according to Nikolai Sinai. I want Samuel to address this. How do you praise the gods on the one hand and then condemn them in the next, or at the outset sarcastically refer to them and then basically praise them? It doesn't make sense. And then immediately rebuked. I mean, if he was to be rebuked and then he changed, what's the significance behind this compromise? Because then the compromise doesn't work. It doesn't make sense. And then the story itself makes, which was said to rebuke him, the verses which were said to rebuke him, Samuel just simply glossed over this. 22 verse 52 and 17 verse 73 were revealed almost a decade later. It is incredulous to believe that the verses which were said to repeal the satanic verses were revealed a decade later. It was, of course, a scandal. And why, the reason why the followers left paganism was because they condemned the gods, the unjust society of pagan society. Why did they not object to show any kind of disgust to this? The other important point, no extant satanic verse texts predate the late 2nd or 8th century, 200 years after the Prophet. And the missionaries that have latched on to this ingenious argumentation in order to present this as authentic or to basically preach the gospel, it's an extremely dishonest and a wholly suspect motif to follow. If you want to preach the gospel, do so honestly. When you cast doubt about the integrity of the Quran or the integrity of the Prophet, do so with some degree of integrity, do so with some degree of honesty. Samuel operates within the polemical discourse. I'm not saying Samuel personally is a good guy, but I'm saying the polemical missionary discourse on this makes no structural, historical, chronological, or linguistic sense. But it's presented in the fashion it has, and therefore, I don't know if I have anything to rebut Samuel after this presentation, because there is no substance or basis to the satanic versus story. You need to keep up with the latest research. The Quranic text is unimpeachable. Nikolai Sinai, John Burton, John Esposito, many modern day Western scholars are pointing this particular point. And therefore, Samuel, I'll be interested in seeing what you say in the rebuttal. But it's important. You have to keep up with the latest research on this particular issue, why this is an uncredible and the story has no scientific or legitimate basis. Thank you very much, Rudolph. I hope I'm on time.
I give you 3 seconds